Hello, my name's Karen van Creveld. I've been a lighting designer for more than 20 years, and I have recently begun a PhD at UCL looking into the effects of light on our health and well-being. My talk today will focus on 5 principles of healthy lighting and the corresponding known effects on our non-image forming functioning and hence on our health and well-being. In 1948, the World Health Organization defined health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And for those of us interested in lighting, we've never before been more interested in how to use light to benefit our well-being. Recent discoveries and advances in photobiology have shown that the retina is far more complex than we once imagined, with different photoreceptors and different pathways leading to multiple parts of the brain, and having an effect not only on vision, but on many other processes. And this has led the CIE to define 5 principles of healthy lighting. The first one is that the daily light dose received by people in industrial countries might be too low. And here we're talking about light intensity. Then we have healthy light is inextricably linked to healthy darkness, and this is about the duration of light. Then we have light for biological action should be rich in the regions of the spectrum to which the non-visual system is most sensitive, and clearly we're talking about spectrum here. Then we have the important consideration in determining light dose is the light received at the eye, both directly from the light source and reflected from surrounding surfaces, and we're talking about distribution. And finally, the timing of light exposure influences the effect of the dose timing. And guess what? We're talking about timing. The report also suggests that these 5 principles should lead to a renewed emphasis on architectural daylighting. Daylight is rich in those areas of the spectrum and bright at those times of the day that seem most important for these processes. Now, before we get on to talking about these 5 principles in any detail, I wanted to just show you this slide to demonstrate the complexity of the subject we're talking about and the complexity of light's impact on humans, which really takes 3 mechanisms to deliver. So firstly, we have light through the skin, light through our visual system, and then light through our non-image forming functions. And the traditional definition of light identifies it as electromagnetic radiation that stimulates vision. However, we now know conclusively that photoreception in the eye leads not only to vision, but also to effects on physiology, mood, and behavior. And these effects are termed non-visual or non-image forming. Now, I'm just skipping through the next 2 slides because we have a very strict timekeeper over here. And I won't have much time to talk to you about the structure of the retina or the pathways leading to the brains. But if anyone's interested, please do get in touch and I can put you, pass you the relevant literature. Right, the first thing we have to say is about intensity. Now, for more than 100 years, we've focused on developing artificial lighting sources to meet our visual needs, and in the misguided belief that the only purpose of light entering the eye was to enable us to see. However, we now know conclusively that light does much more than this. But still, our current light technologies, our lighting standards, our applications all have to do and all are designed to meet a small part of the retina, the fovea's response to incoming light. And this has led us to design our internal environments to light levels that bear no resemblance whatsoever to the light levels that we would experience outdoors. So for example, the recommended standard of illuminance for an office, a modern office these days, is between 300 and 500 lux. And this is deemed to be sufficient to enable us to undertake most visual tasks that are required. However, as you can see on the spectrum I've done, if we go outside and under a bright, sunny blue sky, the illuminance level that we're we would expect to reach is in the region of 100,000 lux. And even on a dull day, under an overcast sky, we're looking at 10,000 lux. Following the revolutionary discovery of melanopsin and the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells about 20 years ago, we now understand that in addition to vision, light incident on the retina has a profound effect on our health and well-being because it sets the timing of our biological clock and promotes entrainment to the local time on Earth. Consequently, I think that we must acknowledge that the requirement for light in our built environment is no longer limited to providing for vision. However, this raises the question of how much light we need. I'm just giving you an indication here that throughout the day, this is a typical day and a typical day's light exposure. So when it comes to how much light we need, unfortunately, there is as yet no agreement about the lighting thresholds that we need to enable our non-visual systems to work optimally. What is clear, though, is that the light levels under which we evolved for millions of years are so dramatically higher than those which we provide for our indoor environments that I think this must give us an indication to start rethinking our whole light environment. I mean, the images that I'm showing you here are typical of what a working person experiences through the day. And as you can see, the light levels are pretty grim, pretty low, and we all feel dog-tired at 3 o'clock. So I've got about 10 minutes before you're all going to be falling asleep. Right, so how do we measure this light? Now, the other big disappointment, I'm going to say, is that we can't use traditional photometry to measure light for our non-image forming or non-visual functions. Like length, time, and mass, light is a physical quantity with its own SI unit, the candela. But unlike these other units of measurement, the definition of light incorporates the human element. So the sensitivity of the human visual system is not equal across all the wavelengths. And in order to quantify the radiometric energy that reaches the retina, it is weighted by the spectral sensitivity of the different kinds of photocells within the retina. And this has given rise to separate spectral sensitivity functions for the rods and the 3 types of cones. And the result of this is the basis of what we call the photometric system. So consequently, the human visual system is embedded in the very terms we use to measure and define light. And so when it comes to talking about light for our non-visual and non-image forming functions, traditional photometry cannot be used. We really have to deal and work with watts per meter squared, which is the raw radiometric data entering the eyes. Okay, we're on to now the next principle, which is that healthy light is inextricably linked to healthy darkness. And this has to do with our circadian system. And the circadian rhythms present in almost all plants and animals, including humans, are driven by circadian clocks, which regulate various biochemical, physiological, and behavioral processes. For example, our sleep-wake cycle, our alertness, hormone production, metabolism, gene expression, etc., all follow a rhythmic pattern throughout the day in tune with the light-dark cycle. And the circadian system is endogenous and self-sustaining, that meaning that even without an external cue, it will continue to operate, but on a slightly longer than 24-hour basis, usually around about 24.2 hours, which does accumulate after some time. But however, in order for an organism to function efficiently within its environment, the circadian system is fine-tuned to the local light-dark pattern that happens because of the Earth's daily rotation. So in evolutionary terms, the purpose of the circadian system is to enhance the efficiency and survival of an organism by allowing them to anticipate and adapt to changing environmental conditions. So the circadian system is not just a passive system responding to the environment, it actually anticipates and is predictive of changes to come. Now, the most important thing to remember in all of this is that it's not light alone that sets the circadian rhythm. It's actually the pattern of light and dark together that create the right kind of contrast between each other and sets for timing of different processes to happen at distinct and predictable periods throughout the day. So light alone cannot sustain a healthy circadian system. Correctly timed darkness is needed to complete the system. Industrialized societies are no longer regulated by the daily pathway of the sun. On the contrary, we're living in round-the-clock lifestyles with very limited hours of true darkness and increasingly little exposure to daylight. In lighting terms, many of us are living in a perpetual state of twilight. And this has far-reaching effects on our health and well-being. Richard Hobday estimates that in industrialized societies, we're spending about 90% of our time in indoor environments. And this has far-reaching health implications on all elements of our health, the mechanism that goes through the skin, the eyes, and our non-image forming functions. So we're getting vitamin D deficiency, we're having an extreme escalation of myopia in children, and we can only imagine that we're having some detriment to our health and well-being on the non-visual side as well. And this situation is made even more serious by the worldwide escalation of urbanization that's happened in the last 10 years. And if one reads the statistics, they're quite terrifying, just how many people are becoming urbanized throughout the world. At the moment, about 50% of us live in urban environments, and this is set to escalate. And the issues connected with an urban environment not satisfying our circadian system and our non-visual system is only set to multiply. And in very dramatic terms, this upheaval of our evolutionary environment is being spoken about by people in the health and well-being world as a coming tsunami of chronic diseases, including cancers, type 2 diabetes, cognitive impairment, and depression. So on that cheery note, we are going to move on to the next principle of healthy lighting, which is that light for biological action should be rich in the regions of the spectrum to which the non-visual system is most sensitive, and we're talking here about the light spectrum. Now, these are some holiday pics that I took from the same position, gosh, I wish I was there still, showing from early morning, pre-dawn, to late at night, and they sort of follow a snake, queuing at the airport thing, to show you just how dramatic the change of light color is throughout the day. And I think this is something that we often don't, we are all aware of it, but we tend to generalize morning light, midday light, afternoon light. But actually, when you look at this, you can tell very clearly which time of the day it is. There's almost like a feeling about the color of the light. And the individual photoreceptors involved in both visual and non-image forming systems contribute to both systems. So it's not this clear-cut situation that our rods and cones operate on the visual system and the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells operate on the non-visual system. Actually, at some point, these different systems combine and their signals combine. This is the part that scientists really don't understand yet, and this is really the crux. The parts of the brain that are lit up by light are varied, and I think we are not even near to understanding the complexity of these. And so, just to quote, there was an international workshop on circadian and neurophysiological photometry in Manchester in 2013, and they concluded with regard to the spectrum that convincing evidence, I quote, convincing evidence for a single action spectrum explaining all circadian and neurophysiological effects under all conditions in humans and animals does not exist. In fact, there's unlikely to be one widely applicable action spectrum. Another thing we don't know. But what we do know is that the spectral content of daylight is suitable for both our visual and our non-image forming functions. Daylight contains all the wavelengths in the visible spectrum, plus a few extras, and it varies over the course of the day, synchronizing with our circadian rhythms. And with the exception of incandescent light, most artificial light sources emit their light in in narrow bandwidth wavelengths. And the lighting industry has come up with the concept of correlated color temperature to give an approximate explanation for the appearance of white light. Now, as we in the lighting industry understand, two sources with very different spectral compositions can both be termed the same CCT value. When it comes to considering light for our non-image forming functioning, this is no longer useful. So CCT cannot be used when we're talking about non-visual effects. It's just not accurate enough. We need to really be talking about the actual spectral content of the light reaching the retina. I have to speed up. We're on to the 4th or the 7th, and we're talking about the principle of light distribution. And humans are diurnal species, exposed to light while engaged in cognitive tasks. And that means throughout the day, we're moving around in different environments, engaged with people, doing different things all the time. And I think we need to start thinking more about the actual lit environment, the reflected lit environment, and not so much about the source of light. Because in contrast to scientific research, which is undertaken in laboratories for obvious reasons, laboratory scientific work usually uses very narrow band light source. The occupants are often kept in the dark before the experiment. They are often have their eyes artificially kept open. They're sat in a very rigid position, and they're involved in a very controlled task. They're also really sat in a booth, looking at an opal screen of light with no spatial differentiation. Now, this research is obviously essential to further our understanding of all these processes, but in no ways can this data be transferred to a real architectural environment, because that's not what we see. We see light that's reflected from all the surfaces and all the architecture around us. And I think it's the conscious modulation of light in connection with architecture which is what we really need to focus on. And these are some images where I think it's been done very beautifully. And I think you would agree that the quality of light just from these images, let alone being in the space, is an entirely different experience from telling somebody that it's a 300K light source. I don't think it makes much sense. And just going back really to the olden days of Richard Korth, I don't know if any of you came across him, 1982, Richard Korth, talking about spectrum. So it's way before many of you were around. And he talking about the spectral composition, and I'll just read the last part of his quote because of time. And he says it's the spectral reflectivity of the surfaces of our environment which largely controls the wavelength composition of light which enters the eyes. So again, I think we just need to extend our understanding of what we're talking about and beyond the lamp and the light source that we're dealing with. Right, and now we're on to the final of the 5th principles, which is the timing issue. Now, the same dose of light can elicit both positive and negative effects depending on when it is experienced. This is due to our biological circadian system, which in turn is influenced by our age, our gender, our geographical location, our prior light history, and our genetic chronotype. Now, according to Foster and Kreitzman in their book, Circadian Rhythms, I quote, there have been hundreds of studies showing that a broad range of activities, both physical and cognitive, vary across the 24-hour day. So, for example, believe me, tooth pain is lowest in the morning. Believe it? Proofreading is best done in the evening. Labor pains usually start at night, and most natural births happen in the early hours of the morning. So it is likely that most of these systems are controlled or affected by our own circadian systems. Other examples of physiology and behavior have been shown to have a very standard and regular rhythmic 24-hour pattern, such as our core body temperature, our alertness, hormone production, blood pressure, etc. But I think what it says is that an organism is set up to operate differently at different times of day. And the most profound of these 24-hour systems is our sleep and alertness rhythm. And this varies amongst individuals, and the term chronotype has been devised to explain the differences between those who are biologically inclined to wake up early. They're termed larks, like birds who wake up early. They wake up early and they go to bed early. And on the other extreme, there are the owls who cannot go to sleep early and rarely wake before midday. And the rest of us are boringly in between. So it's 10 to 15% on either of the extremes, and the rest of us are about in the middle. And with the advent of electric lighting, modern society has resulted in a round-the-clock lifestyle where the natural connections between rest and activity and the environmental light and dark have been degraded and even at times broken. So instances where there's a rapid change in our sleep patterns, such as transmeridian travel, demonstrate the negative effects of what's called acute circadian disruption. We've all, I'm sure, experienced some jet lag and how rubbish we feel with it. The ramifications of chronic disruption of the circadian clock, that's long-term disruption, are only beginning to be understood, but we don't quite understand fully what the implications of that are. But even excluding some of these more extreme examples of circadian disruption, we have to look at what is called our social timing. And school start times and work start times often work against one circadian system. So, for example, we usually work on two timetables, one during the week where we wake up with the alarm, and the other one on weekends where we have a lie-in, and therefore our rest period is more aligned with our natural circadian system. And the difference between these two timetables is what's called social jet lag. And this is particularly prevalent amongst teenagers. Anybody who has experience of teenagers will recognize this. And don't blame them, but they are biologically predisposed to go to sleep later and to wake up later. So asking a teenager to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is like asking a 50-year-old to wake up at 5. They feel pretty much half asleep. So school times that start at 8 or 8:30 with science and maths in the early part of the day are really designed to satisfy the alertness and awakeness of the teachers giving the lessons, not the teenage students sitting and listening to them. They're still asleep. Now, on a more serious note, living against one's circadian clock has metabolic consequences. And for example, social jet lag is associated with an increased body mass index. With every hour of social jet lag, the probability of being overweight or obese increases by 30%. That's with the same calorie intake. That's quite startling. I can just see the newest fad diet coming online. Also, on a more positive note, those larks amongst us are usually expected to have a more cheerful disposition because we're more attuned to our social time. Now, the last little point that I'm going to really quickly talk through is that in medicine, this timing issue is being used is receiving quite a lot of information, so a lot of attention. So the timing at which we administer drugs and treatments has an effect on its outcome. For example, if we give somebody an anti-flu vaccination in the morning, we see a stronger immune response than if we give them the same vaccine in the afternoon. And now I'm just going to read this because I don't want to mess up the stats. The administration of many cancer treatments is also being examined from a personal timing perspective to maximize the effects of the drugs and limit the toxicity of the effects on our healthy cells. And in experimental models, more than 30 anti-cancer drugs have been found to vary in toxicity and efficacy by as much as 50% as a function of their timing. That's quite something, I think. Okay, I've nearly finished, and I've just wanted to say that I've given you here a very small flavor of this very exciting world that's opening up before us, which has to do with light and health. And I think that we need to bear with the science. Things are not known yet. There's still much to know. We need to make sure that we're not trying to give light as a drug because we don't know enough about it yet. But I do think, with regard to these 5 principles of healthy lighting, a renewed interest in the importance and functionality of daylight is most certainly the way forward. Thank you very much.